I'm going to be talking to you today about, the fight for socialism. So we're often asked, why socialism? Why Cuba? Why Venezuela? What's it got to do with us here in Britain? And we have to remember that the ideological political battle waged against socialism didn't end with Fukuyama's proclamation of the end of history. It continues today in a campaign of disinformation against any anti-imperialist struggle, from the pages of The Guardian to the school books and lecture theatres. We must patiently explain the need to fight for socialism here in Britain, and that socialist Cuba and the Bolivarian revolutionary process in Venezuela are at the forefront of a global struggle for justice. Firstly, we need to understand how sovereignty and social justice are bound up with the question of socialism. The Cuban Revolution triumphed in 1959. However, the Revolutionary War had raged for decades, from the struggles of José Martí, Antonio Maceo, and Maximo Gomez against slavery and Spanish colonialism, to 1953, when Fidel Castro faced imprisonment after leading the 26th of July attack on the Moncada barracks. Fidel conducted his own legal defense, denouncing the US-backed Batista regime, describing the 600,000 Cubans without work and the 500,000 farm laborers in miserable shacks working 4 months of the year and starving the rest. At the time, only 11% of Cubans drank milk, only 4% ate meat, 90% of rural children had parasites, and 43% of the population were illiterate. 6 years later, when the rebels marched into Havana, forcing Batista to flee, they had to find solutions. How could they address the problems of land, industrialization, housing, unemployment, education, health? How could they address this in an island systematically underdeveloped by colonialism, then imperialism, dependent on sugar exports, the playground of the rich and famous, whilst the poor majority struggled and starved? Foreign ownership of significant sectors of the economy, leeching from the people and the land, was clearly a barrier. The revolutionary government expropriated the US-owned companies. Casinos were turned into schools. Sex workers were offered retraining. A major land reform expropriated estates over 1,000 acres. Transport, credit, and industry were taken into state hands to fund social needs. These were radical steps, though the new government was not explicitly socialist. Rather, it was a multi-class, multi-party alliance of revolutionaries determined to meet the needs of the rural farmers and the urban workers who had carried out the revolution, alongside representatives of the middle class and nationalist bourgeoisie who sought only technical and administrative reforms. So these first steps drew the wrath of US imperialism, indignant that the rebels in Havana, just 90 miles from Florida, dared to expropriate US property and profits. They knew the Cuban Revolution would have a deep political impact, as eyes from all over the Americas watched eagerly. Washington backed a campaign of terror, funding and arming Cuban mercenaries who blew up hotels and assassinated school children who were literacy teachers in the Great Literacy Campaign. On the eve of the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion, Fidel declared that the revolution was for socialism, stating, "What the imperialists cannot forgive is the dignity, the firmness, the courage, the ideological integrity, the spirit of sacrifice, and the revolutionary spirit of the Cuban people. This is what they cannot forgive. The fact that we are right here under their very noses and that we have carried out a socialist revolution." The struggle for social justice in Cuba necessitated a fight against foreign control of land and natural resources. The question of sovereignty was not just about political independence, but also about economic independence. Imperialism would not give an inch. Socialism was the only answer. 4 decades later, similar questions faced the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela. When oil was first struck in 1908, a string of US-backed dictators and puppet governments secured juicy profits for imperialism. Venezuela was left dependent on exporting crude and importing everything else. 70% of the population suffered poverty and repression. In 1989, after oil prices collapsed, President Carlos Andrés Pérez imposed a neoliberal IMF austerity campaign. Petrol prices doubled overnight. Food and transport costs skyrocketed. This sparked the Caracazo. It was a wave of protests and riots that was brutally repressed by the military, killing 3,000. In response, in 1992, Hugo Chavez launched a military uprising. Though he was defeated, Chavez appeared on the television saying, "Por Aurora, for now, our objectives have not been met." And this slogan, "Por Aurora," was taken up by the masses. They had risen up. Though for now they were defeated, tomorrow a new dawn would come. Under popular pressure, Chavez was eventually released and elected president in 1998 in a landslide victory. In power, Chavez convoked an assembly to rewrite the constitution, resolving to plough oil revenues into poverty-busting social programs in healthcare, housing, education, and subsidized food. He was targeted by a short-lived coup in 2002, then an oil lockout the following year. Having been quickly drawn into political participation, discussing the new constitution and setting up land and water committees, the working class defeated both, descending from the hillside barrios to surround the presidential palace and taking over the oil refineries and restarting production. That was the scenes outside the presidential palace in 2002. And these were the workers who defeated the oil lockout. This experience radicalized Chavez. He began his presidency searching for a third way between capitalism and socialism, praising the political platform of then Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair. However, the vicious reaction of Venezuela's comprador bourgeoisie and the US-backed oligarchs blocked every move. Again, questions of food, housing, healthcare, social justice necessitated sovereignty over land and resources. And it brought the Bolivarian Revolution into direct conflict with US imperialism. Chavez sought to deepen working class mobilization, launching the communal councils as an experiment in participatory democracy. In 2005, Chavez declared that the Bolivarian Revolution had chosen the path of socialism. Today, the human race is facing crisis on all fronts. Escalating war, climate change, zoonotic pandemics, economic crisis. Socialism is the only system that can confront these crises for the majority. It is a system of popular power, where planned economy directs production for the aim of achieving social justice. A welfare-based development strategy, where goods are produced to meet human needs, as opposed to commodities produced for private profit. Where resources are used in a planned, rational way, where systematic efforts are made to develop a popular consciousness which values solidarity, cooperation, internationalism, environmental protection, confronting the selfishness and consumerist patterns imposed on us by capitalism and unlocking a huge sea of human potential. Cuba and Venezuela again provide examples that we can learn from. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Cuba lost 85% of its trade overnight. GDP contracted by 35%. Rationing ensured that nobody starved. Children were guaranteed milk. Planned blackouts ensured that hospitals were never without power. And a drive for permaculture and urban farming meant that every green space in the cities was used to produce food. Imaginative solutions that fixed Soviet machinery when spare parts were no longer accessible were put into place. So this is some of the urban farming that you can see anywhere you go in Havana. This was the special period. US sanctions were tightened as imperialists were desperate for Cuba to fail. Yet the will of the people prevailed. Cuba today has the highest doctor-to-patient ratio in the world. It has universally free education up to and including postgraduate. Healthcare and education are considered human rights. Cuba's biopharma sector is state-owned. It means there's no private interests or speculation. Medicines that Cuba cannot afford or access because of the US blockade have to be produced domestically. Today, nearly 70% of the medicines are produced in Cuba, including many groundbreaking treatments. Cuba produced 5 COVID vaccinations. And it is not just Cubans who benefit. Since 1960, over 600,000 Cuban medical professionals have worked in around 170 countries. Its Henry Reeve International Medical Brigades have helped 3.5 million people in 21 countries affected by natural disasters. In addition to this, 29,000 doctors from 105 nations have graduated free of charge from ELAM, Havana's Latin American School of Medicine. Cuba even sent doctors to fight against COVID-19 to Italy when the rest of Europe had turned its back. This is a truly inspiring example of international solidarity. So in the fight against climate change, socialism also shows us that it is the only option. Capitalism, in its relentless drive for profit, is constantly polluting, rebelling against any attempts to rein in carbon emissions, exhausting the soil, contaminating vital water resources, threatening the entire human race. In stark contrast, socialist Cuba is recognized as the most sustainably developed on the planet, combining a high level of human development with a low carbon footprint. Thanks to urban farming, 70% of the fruit and vegetables eaten in Havana are produced in Havana province. Solar panels power remote rural schools and health clinics. Sugar mills burn the waste of sugarcane as biomass, allowing them to be self-sufficient. Community-based initiatives find solutions to reducing fuel and electricity consumption, whilst the state works hard to expand industrial solar and wind farms. As a small island nation in the Caribbean, Cuba will be disproportionately affected by rising temperatures and rising sea levels. Tarea Vida, the 100-year Life Task Project, has already begun its work to mitigate, adapt and protect its population, ensuring that no one is left behind. Compare this to the devastation in Florida in the last month, where the rich can protect themselves and recover their assets, while the poor are left to barricade themselves in and to struggle. Cuba is able to achieve all of this without exploiting other nations, without launching wars for resources, and despite systematic underdevelopment by colonialism and then neo-colonialism. And of course, they're able to achieve this despite the imposition of the US blockade. This is the longest standing, most comprehensive set of sanctions in history. From the first sanctions in 1961, the US blockade is designed, in the words of Lester D. Mallory, the former US Assistant Secretary of State, to weaken the economic life of Cuba, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow the government. It is extraterritorial. You just try sending money to Cuba. You just try sending money to anyone in Europe with a reference, Cuba. Your transaction will be blocked. And this is despite Britain having legislation supposedly to protect trade from US sanctions. You can see at the bottom here, we've got the 1 Cent for Cuba campaign that we're active in. And this is across Europe, including comrades in Canada. It's a campaign that we're exposing the extraterritorial blockade against Cuba that is imposed by the banks. And so we've been picketing Metro Bank, HSBC, Barclays, all the banks on the high streets of Britain for their role, their complicity in enforcing the US blockade. And we urge people to find out a bit more about it, come speak to any of us and get involved. Ships docking in Havana are prohibited from docking in the US for 6 months. US investors systematically buy up shares in companies that trade with Cuba so that they fall under blockade regulations. This economic warfare costs Cuba more than $13 million each and every day. Just 25 days of blockade costs enough to purchase all the basic medications required by Cuba for a year. This is internationally recognized collective punishment. In a few days at the end of the month, the UN will overwhelmingly vote against the US blockade of Cuba for the 32nd year in a row. You can see which countries last year voted in favor of maintaining the blockade. The US? Anyone want to guess the other country? Israel, yeah? Ukraine abstained. Other countries in grey are those that are prohibited from voting at the UN because of sanctions, including Venezuela, which we're going to talk about US imperialist attacks on Venezuela too. So the Cuban people have been living with this economic gun to their heads for over 60 years, yet they continue to defend their socialist revolution. This is testimony to the importance of socialist consciousness and revolutionary determination to stand against imperialist aggression. And it is this same determination that drives the liberation struggles worldwide, from Palestine to Burkina Faso. And I just want to show people, you know, we talk about Cuba all the time, but look, you can't see a single millimeter of pavement because it is full of people out on the streets. And this is what we have to have in our hearts and in our heads when we're defending the Cuban Revolution. It's not about one man. It's not about any individuals. Yeah, of course they have their heroes that have led the struggle, but this is the people. And when people start to discredit the revolution of Cuba, they are actively discrediting all of these people who have come out to support their struggle. And Venezuela's communal movement also holds lessons. Winning power through traditional bourgeois elections, the Bolivarian revolutionary movement inherited a capitalist oil rentier state with key levers of the economy in the hands of oligarchs and monopolies. But against this backdrop, the Venezuelan revolutionaries have carved out space, constructing a parallel system of communal democracy and production, which Chavez envisaged as the building blocks for a future socialist society. Again, when we talk about Venezuela, we don't see these pictures. This is a communal assembly. Communal councils grouped together in neighborhoods. They organize to identify and address the needs of their communities. And then these link to form communes, which organize on a larger scale. Today, there are around 440,000 communal councils and 4,100 communes, with differing levels of self-sufficiency and productive capacity. In the early 2000s, oil prices were high. Increased public spending and purchasing power could promote consumerism, where voters could receive houses, services, and state benefits without committing themselves to the political project. The communes were an important part of the movement, but with state funding in an abundance, they were more focused on distribution than production. As Chavez reflected at the time through his discussions with Fidel, the task of raising political consciousness had been neglected and was the important task of the day. This left Venezuela underprepared for the hardships to come. Chavez died in 2013. Oil prices crashed in 2015, and the US Obama administration declared Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to US national security, opening the floodgates for a raft of excruciating sanctions ramped up under Trump in 2017. Venezuela's international bank accounts were frozen, transactions were blocked, international credit lines were cut off, resulting in scarcity and hyperinflation. Then COVID-19 hit. The US, Britain and Europe backed a string of coup attempts and destabilization efforts, violent street campaigns that saw Chavista revolutionaries assassinated, decapitated and burned alive. Thugs torched hospitals, pharmacies and other cornerstones of the revolution. The imperialists refused and continue to refuse to recognize Venezuela's elections, instead imposing their own interim president and placing a bounty on the head of democratically elected President Nicolas Maduro and backing forces attempting to assassinate him. I wanted to show this because, in the last months, 2 months, we've been inundated with pictures of the so-called opposition in Venezuela and their protests. But this has not been in the pages of The Guardian or the BBC. The fact that all around the country, these are all different cities, yeah? We've got Caracas, we've got Bolivar, we've got Nueva Esparta, yeah? That the streets are painted red with the revolutionaries. So despite all of these attacks, the blockade, the destabilization, the scarcity, the communes and the social movements mobilized. They defeated violence and destabilization. They apprehended mercenaries and consistently took to the streets in their tens of thousands. Facing down sanctions and scarcity, the communal movement evolved from an experiment in participatory democracy and distribution. It evolved from this to a method of survival, finding solutions to crisis. Urban communes built links with those in the countryside, sending volunteers to farms and bringing affordable fresh produce back into the cities. They distributed state food boxes, protecting the most vulnerable. They found ways to produce soap, cleaning products, nappies, school clothes, PPE, and they distributed these as products, not commodities, in working class communities. This is an example of the food distribution. They supported COVID vaccination programs and they helped to keep COVID fatalities low. They founded the Workers' Productive Army, which fixed machinery and restarted production in sites across the country. This heroic effort, plus important blockade-busting measures taken by the state, has allowed Venezuela to weather the storm. And today, 80% of the food is domestically produced. And alternative industrial inputs boost import substitution and non-oil exports are rising. They are breaking out of the dependency that they have been consigned. Again, some communal production. Mass commitment to anti-imperialism and conviction in the socialist process has been crucial. Interviewed in our newspaper, I did mean to pick up a copy of the paper and show you, but maybe someone else can do that. But if you haven't got a paper, you need to get one. We interview Hernan Vargas, who, he's a former vice minister for the economy in the Ministry of Communes, and it's a really useful interview. He explained to us, we can't go back to the stability of 2012. No, we need to build socialism as an answer to the crisis. So these lessons are crucial for us here today. Socialism is the only system able to safeguard human life on a mass scale and use the Earth's resources in a planned, rational way. We need to build popular political consciousness, advocating for socialism in every area of our work, whatever political question we're addressing. We defend the examples of Venezuela and Cuba, not as utopias devoid of contradiction and challenge, but as real societies constructing an alternative. We have a fight against opportunism on our hands. The majority of the left in imperialist Britain refuse to defend socialist Cuba or Venezuela's Bolivarian revolution. For instance, the Socialist Workers' Party proclaims that the Cuban Revolution was not authentic because it had no connection to the urban masses or trade union movement. They completely rewrite history. It's all there. If you want to study the history of Cuba, you will see the very important role of the urban 26th of July movement. Their analysis of Cuba's economy completely ignores the impact of the US blockade. They demand democracy whilst ignoring the popular participation that Cuba promotes today through its mass consultations and committees for the defense of the revolution. Meanwhile, socialists appeal, who have rebranded themselves as the Revolutionary Communist Party, have completely abandoned the Bolivarian Revolution. They ditched their hands-off Venezuela campaign and have begun repeating the imperialist lie that Maduro did not win July's presidential elections, and have reframed far-right street violence that left 25 people dead as a popular protest against authoritarianism. Neither group lift a finger against the US blockade of Cuba and its extraterritorial application in Britain, nor take any action to demand that the Bank of England return the $1.4 billion worth of Venezuelan gold it has stolen and is in its coffers just a few miles from here. These groups have nothing but contempt for the revolutionaries in Cuba and Venezuela, besieged by coup attempts and asphyxiating sanctions. Yet each time an election comes round, they call for a vote for the racist imperialist Labour Party. Yet liberation struggles around the world embrace the revolutionary examples of Cuba and Venezuela. It is no coincidence that flags emblazoned with Che Guevara fly in Gaza and the West Bank, or that the Palestinian doctors describe their gratitude to Cuba for their medical scholarships as they treat bomb victims in besieged hospitals. Ansar Allah in Yemen celebrate the legacy of Hugo Chavez alongside their own liberation heroes. Burkina Faso has set up cooperation deals with Venezuela and Cuba, resurrecting the committees for the defense of the revolution to defeat counter-revolutionary terrorism, which the late revolutionary socialist leader Thomas Sankara had modelled on Cuba's example. Cuba and Venezuela are playing an important role in regional cooperation initiatives and global South-South cooperation. From participation in BRICS to the regional development of ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas, they join the calls to prosecute Israel for war crimes. They send aid to Gaza and Lebanon, training their doctors whilst their leaders have taken to the streets in solidarity with Palestine. You know, we just saw a massive example of this in Havana. All the government leaders, they were out. The president of Cuba, out with a Palestine flag, with a keffiyeh, yeah? Do we see that anywhere? It's clear. So we know what side we're on. We know what side we're on. Forward, ever. Backward, never. Bilrum, Bildam, Naftika ya Palestine. Bilrum, Bildam, Naftika ya Palestine. Hasta la victoria siempre. Venceremos. We must have socialism. Thank you.